Hi all, and welcome to the Medical AI Lab tutorial session. Every Tuesday, a lab member or an expert guest covers a topic or tool in AI. And these sessions are targeted to be broadly interesting to those interested in the cutting edge of AI and its applications to health and medicine. This week, we have an expert guest and a longtime colleague of mine, Zach Harned, talk about the FDA, AI machine learning, and medical devices, which is a very important intersection for work that we do. So thanks for being with here, Zach, here with us, Zach, and looking forward to your talk.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, delighted to be here. I've got some slides I'll quickly share with everyone. Okay, are those showing up okay? Can you guys all see that? Okay, wonderful. So yeah, today we're going to be hitting a really fun and interesting topic, at least I think so, on sort of AI, ML in the FDA space. For those of you who don't know or haven't sort of looked already, Pranav actually has a great AI health podcast on this topic with Adriel Saporta, with a wonderful guest speaker, Bakul Patel, who we'll be talking about later. A great resource, highly recommended. Today's will be basically like a poor man's version of that, so we might as well go ahead and start muddling through. So first, I'll give a quick disclaimer. I'm sort of an attorney at Fenwick West. I work in intellectual property and technology transactions. And Fenwick West is a sort of premier technology and life sciences law firm. Because of that, it means I'm not permitted to give legal advice outside of a client relationship. So for today, I will not be providing any legal advice. Instead, I'll be providing legal education, which keeps us all out of trouble and is just sort of providing some general info on this really interesting topic. Okay, so first of all, why should you care about the FDA? So first of all, FDA is giant, right? They just regulate a huge percentage of the consumer spend, and their main job is to ensure the safety and effectiveness of those sort of consumer products out there. So you might first wonder, am I, or whatever the product I'm selling, subject to the FDA's regulatory authority? If you're a medical device, then you are. You might then consider, if that's the case, is there some exemption that applies to me? And if not, then you want to wonder, well, what do I have to do to stay out of trouble with the FDA? And that's going to be questions like, how do you pursue sort of, a specific type of regulatory clearance or approval? This might be things like a 510K or a PMA or a de novo sort of pathway. And I've actually done a talk for Pranav before, although I forget if it's recorded, where we sort of go through some more of those details. It takes quite a bit of time, so we're going to sort of breeze over that today to make sure we hit the AI sort of nice and hard. And but there's lots of great info out there on sort of making these specific decisions. Now, okay, why does all of that matter? Because the FDA, like the Hulk, is not very friendly when it's angry. So the sort of famous case was with 23andMe back in the early 2010s, and you definitely want to be avoiding these kinds of headlines. So this is sort of the reason why you want to be trying to stick as closely to the FDA's good side as you can. Now, how does the FDA regulate? So they're, like all executive agencies, they can use sort of three tools: rules, regulations, and guidance, which maybe you've heard of before. So rules and regulations, these are binding, meaning that they have the full force of law, just like a law, that's passed by Congress. And, sort of these are the relevant parts where you can go sort of, search through them if you're so inclined. Additionally, there's guidance, which is non-binding, right? Meaning it doesn't have the full force of law, but it's still a really good idea to follow. And actually, this is the main way in which the FDA regulates, is by this pure sort of guidance-based means. And a lot of that comes from the fact that you can get guidance out much more easily or more quickly than you can sort of pass rules and regulation. There's a lot more sort of admin law process that has to be done. And FDA has sort of prioritized that, and that's what they've done. And it's great because it means there's lots of publicly available guidance where you can sort of, seek to understand what the FDA is doing. And that's a lot of what we'll be reviewing today, actually. So here's a giant chart of the FDA structure. Luckily, we're just going to be concerned with this over here, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH. That's where medical devices get regulated. There used to be the Division of Digital Health that lived within there. It's now become its own center of excellence, and it's headed up by Vakul Patel, who I mentioned before, Pranav interviewed. There's lots of other interesting centers that deal with AI and ML at the FDA, so in particular CDER and CBER. These are the centers that regulate sort of drugs and biologics, but we're not going to be discussing that today. We're just going to be doing medical devices. Okay, so this is just a little more background on the Center for Digital Health, which I mentioned sort of only recently became a new center of excellence, and kind of their track record and sort of what they're planning on doing. And a lot of that is what we're going to be reviewing today, just more specifically in terms of AI ML. Now, by way of a little background and a sort of a resource slide I want you guys to have access to later, because there's way too much info up here to go over now, is just to recognize, hey, look, even in the non-AI ML specific space, FDA has been in the software game for a long time, right? So since 2002, this was the earliest of their guidance that they published, and they've done a bunch of them since then. The most recent of which is this 2021 guidance in November. That's actually great. It's very specifically geared towards software, and it's going to be replacing their old 2005 guidance. So these are, again, just like a nice resource of documents you can look through, but I put it up mainly just to show FDA has been regulating software for a long time. So the main sort of novelty here is going to be the AI and ML piece. I put in a couple of slides, so you'll note here the FDA sort of describes these three different types of software. You often hear this distinction between SAMD and SIMD. So this is software as a medical device versus software in a medical device. There's some interesting sort of analysis here to try and figure out, does it matter? When do these sort of distinctions even come up? I think if we have time later, maybe we'll come back. But in my practice run, I was already going over time. So I think we'll sort of skip that for now, make sure we get to the good AI stuff. The one other point I wanted to note, so this is a sort of example of your system, and software architecture that comes up in that 2021 guidance that I mentioned. And if you look at the sort of highlighted part here, you'll note that, right, they're dealing with an AI-based algorithm. So I bring this up just to highlight the fact that if you're working on a cool AI product, it's likely going to be embedded in some other larger part of software. And there's going to be a whole big compliance piece that's totally unrelated to AI, that's just related to software and its architecture and things like that. And so you'll have to be paying attention to those other guidances as well. So it's a big sort of patchwork, that you'll have to sort of be paying careful attention to when you're trying to push one of these things through FDA. Okay, so to the actual AI machine learning business. So this is a slide taken from one of FDA's sort of presentations where they sort of lay out this timeline. We're going to go through each one of these, plus two more that have occurred since this presentation came out. So let's go ahead and dive back to April 2019. So time point one, this is their AI discussion paper with this really pithy name they have here. So again, this is hyperlinked if you want to go sort of check it out in more detail. But we're going to try and walk through some of the elements. And this is probably, we'll spend a lot of time on this because this is where the FDA has fleshed out probably the most of their thinking in a practical basis for how they're planning on regulating and how they're thinking about AI. So first of all, why do they need something like this? The main impetus behind this is that normally if you have software, it's a medical device, you're likely going to be submitting a 510K to get it cleared. But then what if you have to make an update to that software? They have one of the guidances out that I linked to earlier that says, hey, here's how you know whether you need to submit a new 510K when you update your software. What if you're just patching this really small bug? Do you need to go through a whole new submission? And note that a submission, right, might take 180 days plus. So you don't want to be sort of sitting there twiddling your thumbs for 6 months, not able to sell your product while you're waiting for a new submission just because you're patching some software. So they laid out some situations here where, hey, if you make these sort of significant changes, you're likely going to need to submit a new 510K. The worry is that with AI systems, likely those changes are happening, and they're happening a lot. And it would just be totally, sort of unworkable to be having to submit new 510Ks for every time an update like this came out. The sort of band-aid that's been imposed, or the way FDA has been getting around this, is by having locked AI models. So you can have an AI model, but it can't be sort of continuously adaptive or continuously learning. But FDA recognizes, look, that's kind of pulling the rug out from under a lot of what makes AI and ML great. So it's not a long-term solution. We want to be moving toward a long-term solution, but how are we going to make sure we can maintain the safety and effectiveness of this data, of this model, if we're not sort of, continuously monitoring how it's being updated. So that's their big challenge, and this is sort of their proposal for how they think they can do it. And this discussion paper was written truly as a discussion paper. They sort of floated the ideas out, and then they opened it up for comments, to everyone, to then try and get a lot of feedback and find out, hey, are we on the right track? So what did they float? So they floated this total product life cycle approach. This is very similar to their idea for the pre-certification program, which I think also gets brought up in Pranav's podcast. This is a sort of new way that FDA is thinking of certifying digital health products in general, right? Not just AI, ML. That's a much more sort of comprehensive approach and deals with the sort of fast-moving nature of digital health and software. So let's dive into sort of how they're thinking about it here in the AI sphere. So item number one is dealing with these sort of notions of establishing good machine learning practices. We're going to be diving into that in more detail later, so I'm just going to sort of highlight that here and skip for now because we'll get into the nitty-gritty with that shortly. So number two is them trying to figure out how do we make sure we maintain and assure the sort of safety and effectiveness here. And they've basically proposed something called a predetermined change control plan. And they broke that into two components. So the first one is the SAMD pre-specification, or SPS. And basically what that says, hey, look, these are the types of modifications we think we'll be making to our particular AI model. We'll be making sort of performance, sort of updates. We'll be making changes based on its inputs. We'll be giving it new sort of data to train on. We might be pivoting its intended use. It's going to start, for this particular diagnosis, but then, it might move to a separate indication. Then on top of that, they've stipulated this algorithmic change protocol, or ACP. And what they want there is for you to tell them, hey, what's the methodology behind how you plan to implement those changes? So first you say, here's the way we think we'll be making these changes in the future. And then second, you try and, sort of say, here's how we'll be imposing them. So this chart on the right, this is an example of the sort of ACP components that you might be asked to provide. This is a tall order, right? As we know, companies have to pivot, products pivot, things move fast. And you have to do some level of prognostication, but this is kind of the way they're trying to set it up to put some guardrails around, sort of the AI model that you've built. So sort of further flexibility they attempt to provide through this element number 3, which is trying to say, sort of, hey, look, how do we deal when there need to be changes to that SPS and the ACP that you've developed? And so they present sort of a little flow chart here, right? It says, hey, we're dealing with this, AI. You presented us with your SPS and your ACP. First, let's consider, you're making some changes here. Are they the kinds of things that would be required to change for that 510K, sort of decision tree? So that's this decision tree over here from that guidance I mentioned. This is also the items that you saw in that list earlier, where it's like, is it a change to risk controls to prevent significant harm or things like that? So if there's sort of, no deviations there, nor significant deviations, all you have to do is document what you did and you're done. Now, let's say this would be the kind of thing that normally would trigger a new 510K. We move on to the next sort of box, which is that modification outside of the agreed upon SPS or ACP? So here's where the SPS and the ACP are doing the work for you, is normally where you'd have to file that new 510K. If you're making a modification that falls within that predetermined change protocol that you established, now you don't have to file the new 510K. All you have to do is move to the right and document, right? So you're set there. Now, what if like I mentioned, it's a hard game to predict. Your change is outside of the SPS and the ACP. In that case, then you have to ask the further question, are your modifications going to lead to a new intended use? If they are, then FDA says you're going to have to go through a whole new sort of pre-market review. So you've got to do the whole thing over. So the changes are so significant to the AI, we're going to have to put eyes on everything. If it's not a new intended use, it's just a deviation from your predetermined change protocol, then instead you're going to go through this like less onerous focused FDA review, and it's going to leave you with a new predetermined change protocol. So again, they're trying to do the least onerous thing possible. We're still making sure the oversight is necessary. So this is their attempt to provide a little extra flexibility on top of your SPS and ACP, or that is the predetermined change protocol.
So just one question there is, Zach, if you have a new intended use specified in that document, then that goes to no?
Sorry, say that one more time.
Could you have a new intended use specified in the document, in the change protocol, or sorry, the SPS?
So correct. So yeah, let's say you have a new intended use, but it falls within your initial SPS or ACP, then all you have to do is document, because you'd actually be in the previous block where your modification wasn't outside of that sort of agreed SPS ACP. So if you knew going into it, hey, we're going to be using it for skin cancer X, but we're going to be expanding it to skin cancer Y after we get some more data, and you laid all that out and FDA reviewed it and said it was okay, then by the time you move to that new intended use, all you've got to do is document, so long as there's no other changes that exceed SPS and ACP. So the better you predict, the less friction you get down the line.
Great, thanks.
Great question. Okay, and then element number 4, the final part of this TPLC, is just this real world performance, which again is a big component that FDA is building out, not just for AI, but for digital health altogether, where they provided, unfortunately, some sort of rather vague kind of, information here. So they say, hey, look, we're going to require you to make some real world performance commitments. We believe it could be achieved through a variety of mechanisms. And so here's sort of the mechanisms they propose. And they're not, especially clear at this point. Probably the clearest of them is the last one, which says, hey, look, it could be achieved via one of our mechanisms we're already using. And, one of the mechanisms they cite is, dealing with their pre-cert program. So this is how real world performance analytics are conceptualized under the pre-cert program. They cite some other programs too, right? Their case for quality activities. So there's some places where you can look to more concrete things. But this is, I think, one of the areas where they provide sort of less detail. Again, that good machine learning practices, they didn't provide a lot of detail there either, but they have since, which we're going to be looking at in a little bit. So likely this will be another area where they'll be providing more detail in the future. Okay, phew. That's it for the AI discussion paper. So that's how FDA kicked it off. Pretty great. They opened it up for discussion. And then sort of moving along, they've made some additional steps, one of which was to create this collaborative communities program. So a collaborative community, well, FDA defines it. They say it's a continuing forum in which private and public sector members, including the FDA, work together on medical device challenges to achieve common objectives and outcomes. Now, FDA doesn't establish these collaborative communities. Anyone can establish them, and then the FDA can ask to join and can potentially be refused. And they even offer this toolkit, if you're a party and you're interested in creating your own collaborative community, FDA wants to try and help you do that, and then hopefully you'd let FDA join and they can sort of weigh in on that. So here's a number of the collaborative communities. You'll see over to the right, I highlighted 2. The Nest CC, that was the first one they formed. And then obviously there's an AI specific one here, and they collaborated with Xavier in particular on developing the AI ML based SAMD action plan, which is another time point we're going to get to in a little bit. So this is just another way that FDA is sort of, looking beyond their own ken to try and work on these difficult problems. And we'll see this again in time point 4. Okay, before we get there, time point 3. This was a public workshop that FDA put on involving AI and radiology. So I put the hyperlink up here. It's great. The link has a bunch of great resources. There's presentation slides from everyone who's presented there, including presenters from the FDA and other sort of stakeholders from academia, from industry. There's not a lot that I sort of could synthesize for this presentation that we haven't already covered, at least that's strictly from FDA related sources, which I think is the best indication of what FDA is going to be likely to do. The only thing I sort of wanted to pull out here was if you're interested in a radiology specific application, there is some good information there for you that shows a little bit of their sort of history and things like that. I highlighted down here the reclassification in 2020 from PMA to 510K, which is very good news if you want to work on one of those computer-aided detection type models, because a 510K is much, much easier and less expensive than having to do a PMA. So there is lots of interesting work that's happening specifically within radiology, but there's not too much else from this particular conference that's going to weigh on FDA strategy overall. So I want to provide you guys with this info, especially if that's your area, to dive a little deeper. But otherwise, I want to sort of stick to some of the more generally applicable elements of AI. Okay, so as I mentioned a minute ago, there's also this Patient Engagement Advisory Committee. So the FDA, they say, hey, look, the PEAC, this is the first and only advisory committee whose members are all patients, caregivers, and representatives of patient organizations. And the purpose is to bring them together for a broader discussion of important patient-related issues to inform device innovation, development, evaluation, and assessment, and access, sorry. So this is another way FDA is trying to look beyond themselves, right? In the recognition that, hey, look, sort of we're a regulator, but our decisions affect a lot of individuals, and we want to make sure we're getting broad, diverse stakeholder feedback, in particular, from patients, the people who often are most affected by the kinds of decisions we're creating. So this particular committee, it's made up of a core of 9 voting members and 1 non-voting industry representative, and then 1 voting consumer representative. And they've engaged in a lot of activity that's useful to FDA. I highlighted here the 2 AI-specific, sort of undertakings they've done. They have the links here where you can sort of read. This is the cover page over on the right. To their AI and ML advice regarding medical devices. That in particular was taken into account when FDA created its AI ML action plan, which we'll get to in a little bit. And I mention this because, again, if you're working on something and you feel like the FDA is not particularly they're not, on the right track. They're sort of not looking at this in the way that you think they should. Obviously, you can go directly to the FDA to try and sort of help them with this, or you can, provide public comment like to that AI discussion paper. But there are other ways as well, right? You can work through this PEAC. You can work through the collaborative communities to also try and help, bubble up these issues to the FDA's, front of mind. So this is, I think, a great way in which FDA is trying to get broad stakeholder input for their further development of AI ML in their regulatory efforts. Okay, I've alluded to this a bunch already, right? So now there's this AI ML action plan. So basically what this is FDA's response to their AI discussion paper. So they put out the discussion paper and then they open it up to public comment. A bunch of comments were submitted. And then FDA essentially read through all of those, synthesized them, and then sort of created this new action plan that responds to those. I actually was lucky enough at the time to be externing at FDA, and I got to review some of those comments that came in, which ran the whole gamut in terms of level of sophistication. But as part of FDA's mission, you have to read through everything and sort of respond to everything. So this was their attempt to sort of respond. You can see it in much more detail via the link, but I sort of synthesized, the bottom line, which is a couple of commitments they sort of, said we plan to be implementing in the near future. So the first is we want to be issuing a draft guidance on that predetermined change control plan. So when we're going through that TPLC structure earlier and talking about sort of SPS and the ACP, you might have thought, oh, I have like a million questions about how is this actually implemented? What does this actually mean? How is it going to work in real life? That's exactly what number one here is going to aim to achieve, right? Is to give a much more fully fleshed out version of that. Number two is to try and harmonize these good machine learning practices with other sort of, standards and things like that, right? They recognize it's not good to have a bunch of different independent sort of standards out there. We want to be, sort of consolidating and have everyone working off the same set of requirements. So that's another sort of, big point for them. They're going to hold a workshop on transparency, which they did. That's our next time point. So we'll get to that in a second. And then they also want to dive deeper into issues of algorithmic bias and algorithm robustness. And in particular, they're trying to do this through their centers of excellence at UCFF and Stanford and Johns Hopkins in particular. And then finally, they're coming back to this real world performance issue where they want to be sort of investigating this via sort of it being done in a pilot program, purely voluntary basis with a variety of stakeholders. So trying to learn what's the best way to sort of build this circle for real world performance to use to inform the improvement as well as the safety and effectiveness of these AI/ML medical device products. Okay. So as I mentioned, they did end up holding this AI/ML transparency workshop. This was during COVID, so it was all virtual. Like with the radiology, I put the link here. Tons of great resources there. You can sort of review all the presentations, both from the FDA and the stakeholders. Like with the radiology, again, there's most of the really interesting content probably comes from industry and academia and the stakeholders who can sort of freely say, hey, here's what, I think should be done about this kind of stuff. FDA, is more going to issue their opinions, through guidance and things like that later. So there's not as much that, clearly lays out their positions. It's more so, posing questions like they do here. They do present a definition for transparency, which is coming also, I think, from an ISO document they're sort of working on. So this is mainly beneficial just in that it gives you the idea of what FDA is thinking about. There's not a whole lot of direction we've gotten from FDA at this point. But that's not their intention, right? They're sort of moving slow. They're getting the input from everyone, and then likely their next stage will be putting something forward. So keep your eyes peeled on the transparency side of things. Okay. Next is FDA issued a list of their AI/ML enabled devices. They made this sort of a public resource. They did it based only on publicly facing information, right? So if you filed with the FDA and you filed some private information, that's not getting searched here. And they also looked through these additional databases. I think this is easier to understand if you can sort of see what it looks like. So this is sort of the database itself, and you can, sort of readily search it. It's got, I forget, maybe some 300, sort of devices that are in there now. And let's say you click on one, this sort of seen a chest over here. So it pops up this little window, which has all kinds of great information for you. So first of all, it tells you the 510K number, which lets you know this particular device went through a 510K as opposed to doing a de novo review. Like if you click on one of the early IDX, DRs, you would see, oh, there's no 510K, it's just de novo. Additionally, it tells you a regulation number, classification product code. It tells you the decision, which was in this case, it was deemed substantially equivalent. So again, we haven't gone over this, but the process for a 510K is you say, hey, here's my device. Here's a predicate device, which is another one that you already approved that I think is really similar to mine. And then you argue that your device is substantially equivalent to that already approved device. And if you argue very persuasively, then the FDA says, yeah, you get cleared because your device is basically the same as this other device over there. And then they provide a little summary. So we're gonna go through these in a little bit more detail. So let's say you click on that regulation number. Oof, you get hit with this wall of text, right, which looks just like stultifyingly boring, and probably it is, but there's actually lots of good information in there. So first you'll see, okay, what's its classification? It's class 2. So in FDA, you can either be class 1, 2, or 3. That's like low risk, like medium risk, or high risk. Class 2 is important because class 1, low risk, you just have to follow general controls. But with class 2, you have to follow what they call special controls, and they're unique for each device. So for this, we know our particular device, this is something that does, radiology, computer-aided triage and notification. And if you want to know what are the special controls, boom, you get to see all of them here. So if you're building one of these products and you want to know, hey, what does FDA care about? What are they going to make sure that I have in place? This is an easy way to try and find out, what those controls are and what you're going to have to comply with. And similarly, you'll see down in number 2 here, these are the labeling requirements. So you're going to have to provide a detailed description of the patient population for which this device is indicated for use. So there's lots of good, really practical things, you can learn from this kind of information, especially if you have a competitor who, has a product out there that's already been served, because then you can sort of look and see, hey, what did they have to do? If someone's blazed the trail ahead of you, there's a lot of that can be sort of learned there. If not, there's a little bit more sort of guesswork in the process. Okay. Next, there's this classification product code, which again is going to give you some interesting information. It's just going to tell you more about sort of, what this is, what's the technical method there. Is this software only? Is it software involved with hardware? So again, you can sort of just, milk a little bit more information out of it. And then finally, if you click on the summary, this is going to be a big, long PDF that's going to be, sort of not all, but a lot of the information that, was submitted to the FDA about this particular device. So I snipped out just a couple of pieces here to show you, why this is cool. So for instance, you'll see, for this particular device, they believe it should be for prescription use as opposed to over-the-counter direct-to-consumer. So again, if you're trying to do some competitor analysis to figure out what should we do, should we be prescription only or not? You can see that's what they did for their pathway. That way, if you plan on using them as a predicate device, you might smooth things out for yourself if you also decide to go, the prescription only route. Similarly, you can see what they elected to use for their predicate device. So that might be interesting to you, right? Perhaps that device is really similar to the one that you're using. You could use that as a predicate device as opposed to, this newly approved device itself. And similarly, they'll also provide information, not always, but often, on a reference device. So a reference device is something, it can't be used for your sort of clearance for approval purposes like the predicate device, but you can use it to support like your scientific methodology, or maybe if you're making standard reference values. So you'll see not only what that device is, but also how they sort of analyzed it and how they used it. So again, these summary docs, they're big, they're long, they've got all kinds of great stuff. It'll have the device description, its intended use, indications for use, summary of the tech characteristics, performance data. So it'll depend on the device that's submitted, but again, there's all kinds of good stuff there, especially if you're looking to do something similar. Okay. Time point number 8 is the good machine learning practice principles. So this comes in the tradition of FDA's work in drugs and biologics, where they have what's called good manufacturing practice and good clinical practice, GMP or GCP. So now they're trying to do something similar for AI, and they're establishing these GMLP. So it's just a list of these 10 principles here. The list itself, if you click on the link, has more detail, so I'll let you go through that rather than sort of boringly read through these 10. I highlighted a couple of elements that I thought was interesting. Some of them may be sort of common sense, but I thought they were important to sort of see in what FDA is thinking through these sorts of practices. The first is that multidisciplinary expertise is going to be important. I think you guys, probably appreciate that a lot more than a lot of machine learning researchers, given that you're working in this multidisciplinary field of AI in healthcare. But this is just going to be incredibly crucial, and I think FDA is emphasizing that and making sure, that its readers understand its importance. Next, it's going to be important that the data sets are representative of the intended patient population. So again, there's all kinds of different levels of sort of data sets and, the means at which they're gathered. And Are they retrospective? Are they prospective? And I think FDA, again, is just sort of noting here, hey, look, the cleanliness of those data sets is going to be important. And the more closely you hew to sort of who your intended patient population is to who you're actually deploying it on, probably the safer space you're going to be. This next one is that, they want to make sure, hey, look, your design is sort of tailored, and focused on the intended use of the device. I highlight this because there's some interesting legal intricacies here. I won't go too deeply into, but the idea is that, hey, look, FDA is saying stick to the intended use of the device and you'll be safe. Whereas in the tort world, there's also products liability lawsuits, which I'm sure you guys, see every once in a while when there's a car and it's blowing up or things like that, and you want to sue. You can sue under products liability. But products liability counts not just for intended use, but also for foreseeable use. So for instance, if I have some product and it's not supposed to be used in this way, but, a smart person could see that an individual is obviously going to use it for that purpose, then you can still be on the hook for that harm that's caused. And this is important in particular because a defense you might think you have is that, hey, look, if my medical device was, it causes a harm, but it was approved or cleared by the FDA, you might think I have federal preemptive protection. Right, so this is the idea that federal laws can preempt conflicting state laws. And tort laws, so this product liability is going to be a state law claim. So let's say I hurt someone and they come after me, and I want to say, no, the FDA cleared it, so I'm safe. In general, common law remedies or these state law remedies, they're not preempted by these GMP, the good manufacturing process requirements. So if we want to draw an analog between that GMP and the GMLP here, it might mean that similarly, you won't be protected just by having complied with this GMLP if your medical device causes injury to someone and they then sue you under state law. So again, this is all like 100% speculative at this point. But if, I were making an argument to a jury or to a judge or something like that, these are the kind of analogies I would be drawing. So it's at least good to be thinking through probably not just complying with intended use, but likely foreseeable use, right? And again, this happens all the time in the healthcare space where, my user is not going to use it exactly what it's supposed to be done for. They're going to, tweak it, or they're going to do a little something with it. And might that, misuse result in harm? If so, you could be in trouble. So you want to have that front of mind. Next is this issue of the human AI team, right? So again, they're really focusing on sort of human factors here with this human in the loop. And they say, when that's the case, you want to be providing these human factors and interpretability considerations, letting us know how you've taken them into account. Given that's the case, an interesting thing I thought for you guys to think about is what that means in terms of, is that going to make it easier or harder to clear or approve an AI device with the FDA? And that is, will it be simpler if you just try and cut the human out of the loop altogether, and then you just have to provide, your regular sort of, predetermined change control stuff? Or will FDA be more amenable to actually having a human in the loop? But in that case, then you have to provide this additional information of how human factors comes up, how interpretability is dealt with in terms of the user, and might that actually make it harder for you to try and get a device cleared? So this is, again, an open question. I think it's unclear, and there's these two, sort of countervailing factors that I'm not sure which one will win out. So an interesting thing to think further about. Next here, right, again, they're just noting, look, we have to be thinking real world here. It's got to be clinically relevant conditions when you're measuring your device performance. So again, they're not saying RCT necessarily, but they're pushing towards that idea that, hey, look, we want to make sure, the data that we're talking about here is things that's going to apply to the real world. And then the last point I'd highlight here. So, I think you want to always note who's your user, right? In this case, FDA is noting, hey, look, it could be a healthcare provider or it could be a patient, and you need to be providing them with essential information. And what counts as essential information will likely differ between whether that individual is a healthcare provider or whether that individual is a patient. And in the further sort of discussion of the GMLP, for essential information, they note, hey, look, this info, it could include intended use, performance for the appropriate subgroups, info on training and testing data sets, which I wonder, what does that mean? Are they looking for like model cards or like data sheets for data sets, kind of information? Unclear at this point. They further say it could be known limitations, or it could just be a means for your user to communicate product concerns to the developer or manufacturer. So there's a lot of stuff there that I think would have to get unpacked and have to be thought through in terms of developing the user interface. So lots of great stuff here, but that's just sort of a quick overview of a couple of interesting issues I wanted to highlight. And that takes us all the way through our timeline, which is good because I've burned up a bunch of time already. So our last slide here is just trying to be a little even-handed and noting that, right, not everyone is totally enthused with the way FDA has been handling regulation of AI and med devices. So this was a recent paper, I think actually was done by some Stanford professors. I think the last two on the paper are Daniel Ho, who's from the law school, who I know from my time there, and I think James Zhu was the CS author. So essentially what they did was they just kind of analyzed 130 different AI-based devices that were approved by the FDA, and they noted, hey, look, of these, only 4 included prospective study data in their submission. And of those 4, none of them were for high-risk devices. They sort of split, between low risk and high risk. Although it's unclear to me from reading through and looking at their footnotes how they split this high risk, low risk. But either way, a staggering dearth of prospective studies. They noted that only a few of them said we considered kind of demographic subgroup performance. And that also very few of them had multi-site assessment. And that of those few that did have multi-site assessment, it was very few sites, right? It might have only been 2. And they had, the authors raised significant concern that this could lack or lead to a lack of generalization, maybe related to issues of underspecification or things like that. So again, there's sort of point here is that, look, there's lots of room for growth. In particular, I think they are highlighting, sort of the importance of prospective studies, sort of going forward, as well as sort of broad, generalized, sort of deployments on multi-site assessments to sort of show that, these devices are not only safe and effective where they've been deployed, but they'll be safe and effective everywhere they'll be deployed in the U.S. because the FDA is a federal organization. Okay. Well, with that, I think I'll go ahead and wrap up. I know that was a ton of information and we went through it fast, but thanks so much for your guys' attention.
Thanks so much, Zach. That was incredible.